Prince William has just taken control of an estate so valuable and powerful that its secrets could reshape Queen Camilla's future. For years, Camilla's family had deep connections to the property, with relatives working inside an empire that had quietly supported the royal household for decades. But the moment that empire passed into William's hands, the old arrangement began to disappear. One position after another came under scrutiny, and suddenly the woman who had spent years building her place inside the monarchy was facing a problem she could not charm her way out of. Because William did not just inherit land, money, and ancient titles. He inherited control, and what he does with that control next could determine exactly where Camilla lives when Charles is no longer there to protect her. On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, and in that single moment before the world had even absorbed the news, the structure of the British royal family changed forever. Charles became king. That part everyone understood, but something else happened. William became Duke of Cornwall, and with that title came control of one of Britain's extraordinary private estates. The Duchy of Cornwall is worth billions, stretches across thousands of acres, and has generated enormous income for the heir to the throne for centuries. It was once Charles's financial foundation. Now it belongs to his eldest son. And that is where this story becomes much more personal, because buried inside the duchy's history is a connection to Camilla's family, a royal arrangement that lasted for years, and a decision William quietly made after taking control. The decision looked small on paper, but inside the palace, it sent a message everyone understood. And once you see what William inherited, who he removed, and which homes will eventually fall under his control, you will understand why Camilla's future may be less secure than it appears today. The estate belonged to the heir, but William inherited something more important than land. He inherited independence. For decades, the Duchy of Cornwall had provided Charles with an income that helped support his household, properties, projects, and public work. Then, almost overnight, that financial foundation moved from father to son. And this is where the story becomes personal, because the duchy was not simply a collection of farms, cottages, and investments. It was a network of people, contracts, and relationships that had developed during Charles's decades as Duke of Cornwall. When William took over, he gained the authority to decide what stayed, what changed, and who remained connected to the estate. One of the most discussed changes involved Annabel Elliot, Camilla's sister. Elliot had worked as an interior designer connected to duchy properties for many years. Her role existed during Charles's time, and reports indicated that, after William took control, she was no longer working for the estate. The change attracted attention because of the family connection. It was not simply an employee leaving a company. It was the sister of the queen leaving an organization now controlled by the future king. And that distinction matters. William did not need to publicly accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He did not need a dramatic announcement. A contract ending was enough to create a message. Whether that message was intentional or not, the new duke was clearly beginning to shape the duchy according to his own priorities. For Camilla, that had to be uncomfortable. Her family had spent years operating within Charles's world. Now Charles's world was becoming William's world, and William was not obligated to preserve every arrangement his father had created. But there was a deeper history behind the tension. William and Harry had grown up knowing what their father's relationship with Camilla had meant for their mother. Diana's marriage had collapsed under the weight of Charles's relationship with Camilla, and both princes lived through the consequences as children. Whatever their private feelings were, they could not simply erase that history because Camilla eventually became part of the family. When Charles married Camilla in 2005, William publicly accepted the decision. He attended the ceremony and continued his royal duties. But acceptance in public did not necessarily mean every old wound disappeared. Then came another change. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth expressed her wish that Camilla should become queen consort when Charles became king. After Charles's accession, the title evolved further, and Camilla became queen. For William, this meant watching a woman connected to one of the most painful chapters of his childhood move into an extraordinary position inside the institution he would eventually lead. But titles were only part of the story. The real question was control. Who controlled the money? Who controlled the properties? Who controlled the people working around the royal household? After September 2022, William had considerably more control over all three. And that is where the next part begins. Changing one contract was only the visible sign of a much larger transition. William was not simply receiving his father's estate. He was learning what it meant to control his own financial world and decide which parts of Charles's legacy would continue. The answer becomes clearer when you look at what William inherited beyond the duchy. Because Charles does not personally own every royal residence, and the distinction between crown property and private royal property matters enormously here. Sandringham and Balmoral are privately owned estates associated with the monarch. They are not simply government buildings that automatically remain available to every member of the royal family. Their ownership follows the private estate arrangements of the sovereign. When Charles inherited them after Queen Elizabeth's death, they became part of his personal property portfolio. When the succession eventually passes to William, they are expected to pass with it. That creates a completely different situation for Camilla. Right now, she has access to some of the most famous residences in Britain because she is the king's wife. She can appear at Buckingham Palace, stay at Clarence House, spend time at Sandringham and visit Balmoral. From the outside, that can look permanent. But royal life has a way of making temporary arrangements look permanent. The important question is not where Camilla lives today. It is what happens after Charles. If William becomes king, his position changes instantly. Kate becomes queen, and Camilla becomes the widow of the previous monarch. Her public role could continue in some form, but it would no longer be anchored to being the reigning king's wife. That difference is enormous. There is no simple rule saying that a former queen consort automatically receives ownership of the private homes belonging to the previous monarch. The practical arrangements would depend on the new sovereign, the royal household, available residences, and whatever decisions are made at the time. That is why the property issue is more complicated than a story about William simply throwing Camilla out. The law, private ownership, royal conventions, and family decisions all intersect. But one fact remains: William would have far more authority over the future arrangement than he does today. And there is another detail that makes this especially significant. Camilla once owned a private property of her own, Ray Mill House in Wiltshire. It was separate from the royal residences and had long been described as a personal retreat. She eventually sold it after marrying Charles and taking on a full-time royal role. That decision may have made perfect sense when her future seemed permanently tied to Charles's reign, but circumstances change. If Camilla no longer has that private house and Charles is no longer king, her options could become much more dependent on the royal household. She would still have resources, status, and access to the wider royal institution. But the idea that she could simply remain wherever she wanted would be far more complicated. And this is where William's inheritance becomes important again. He is not merely waiting to receive a crown. He is gradually inheriting the financial and property structure that will support his own reign. The duchy gives him financial independence. The private estates give him long-term control over valuable property. His household will eventually make decisions about who receives offices, homes, access, and support. That uncertainty is the real issue. There is no evidence that William has decided to remove Camilla from every royal residence, but there is equally no guarantee that her present arrangements will continue forever. Once Charles is gone, William will be the sovereign, and the entire balance of power changes. That brings the story back to the beginning. William inherited an estate that once financed his father's life as Prince of Wales. He inherited a management system built over decades. He inherited property, income, employees, contracts, and a level of financial independence that gives the future king unusual freedom. And almost immediately, the old system began to look different. The reported departure of Annabel Elliot became the most visible example. Her connection to Camilla made the story much more dramatic, but the broader issue was larger than one person. William was beginning to build an administration that reflected his own priorities rather than simply continuing everything inherited from Charles. That is what succession really means inside a monarchy. It is not only a ceremony, it is a transfer of institutions. People change, staff change, spending priorities change, relationships change. Even the meaning of certain residences can change when the person who owns them changes. For Camilla, the biggest uncertainty, therefore, may not be a single house or a single title. It is the loss of automatic security that comes from being married to the reigning king. While Charles is alive and on the throne, Camilla's position is protected by his authority. She is the queen because he is the king. She has access to royal resources because she is part of the reigning household. She occupies residences associated with that role because the institution has arranged them for her. But when Charles dies, the center of that system moves. William becomes king. Kate becomes queen. The household reorganizes around them. Their priorities become the priorities of the monarchy. Camilla's position would have to be defined again. That does not necessarily mean exile, humiliation, or the loss of every privilege. A former queen consort could continue to have a public role, a residence, security, staff, and royal engagements. The exact arrangements would depend on the circumstances and decisions made at the time. But the important difference is that Camilla would no longer be at the center of the monarchy. William would be. And that is why the duchy matters so much. It was the first major piece of the royal financial structure to move directly from Charles to William. It gave him a glimpse of what his future administration would look like. He could review inherited arrangements. He could change personnel. He could establish his own priorities. He could begin separating his household from his father's. The process was quiet because monarchy rarely announces every internal change with fireworks. Sometimes the clearest signals are buried in financial reports, staff lists, property decisions, and small changes that barely make the headlines. But those small changes can reveal a much larger transition. Charles's era is still continuing. William's reign has not yet begun. Yet the machinery of succession is already moving underneath the surface. And eventually, the biggest transfer will arrive. Sandringham will have a new owner. Balmoral will have a new owner. The royal household will have a new center. The person making the final decisions will be William. For Camilla, that future may be uncomfortable precisely because nothing is guaranteed in the way it appears today. She can have a title without owning the house she lives in. She can have royal status without controlling the institution. She can have access without having permanent ownership. And the man who will eventually control the most important pieces of her royal future is the same man who grew up watching his family fall apart. That does not prove revenge is coming. It does prove that the balance of power has changed. The estate once belonged to Charles. Now it belongs to William. So the story is not really about one sister losing one contract. It is about a new generation taking control. Charles built his system over decades. William is inheriting it piece by piece. And when the final transfer comes, Camilla will have to live with decisions made by him alone. And this is where Camilla's future becomes much harder to predict. When Charles eventually leaves the throne, Kate will become queen, while Camilla's role will change completely. She would become the Queen Dowager, the widow of a reigning king, and her place inside the next reign would depend heavily on decisions made by William, and that is where the uncertainty begins. And William will inherit more than the crown. He will inherit Sandringham. He will inherit Balmoral. He will control the royal household surrounding those properties, and he will have to decide how the former queen fits into the new structure. But there is also no guarantee that Camilla's current living arrangements will remain exactly the same once the new reign begins. Because every royal household eventually reflects the priorities of its sovereign. That is what makes Ray Mill House so important. Before marrying Charles, Camilla owned a private home in Wiltshire that gave her something royal life could never provide, a place that belonged entirely to her. She eventually sold it after becoming committed to her role beside Charles. But if Charles dies and William becomes king, the circumstances could look very different. Because the woman who once had her own private retreat could find herself relying on arrangements controlled by a new king. The woman who spent decades becoming part of the royal establishment could suddenly discover that the establishment has moved on without her, leaving her position dependent on a different generation. And that brings us back to William, because he will sit at the center of that new system. He has already shown that inherited arrangements can be changed. The duchy passed to him, the old system was reviewed, and people connected to Charles's era were no longer automatically protected. But one thing is certain for the future. When the crown finally passes from Charles to William, Camilla's future will enter an entirely different chapter. And the question will no longer be whether she belongs beside the king. It will be whether William wants her there.